Hey guys, Cookie here with another Helldivers 2 tier list. In today's video, I'll be going over all the sentries that are available in the game. To be clear, there are 8 of them. The Flame Sentry, Machine Gun Sentry, Gatling Sentry, Autocannon Sentry, Rocket Sentry, EMS Mortar, and Mortar Sentry, as well as the Tesla Tower. I'll go over how each of them fares against each of the 3 factions, and then crown them a cumulative ranking on the tier list. Sentries have changed a lot over the past year, so I thought it would be a good time to take a minute and think through which ones are the cream of the crop, and what is, well, less desirable. Just like the video where I ranked all the red stratagems, I am basing this list on having all the ship upgrades to improve the sentries. So basically this is rating it as if they were at full power of ability. Starting off the list, I'm going to talk about the Machine Gun Sentry. So I'll be honest, this is not a sentry I used a lot in my casual play sessions because for a long time it was pretty bad. After some buffs though, it got a lot better, but I still wasn't using it much. This was a mistake. The Machine Gun Sentry is quite a diamond in the rough if you aren't using it already. A lot of people may think it's basically the same as the Gatling Sentry, but there is some pretty significant differences. The most crucial of which is the cooldown time, which is one of the Machine Gun Sentry's greatest attributes. It only has a cooldown of 90 seconds, which is 60 less than the Gatling Sentry, and overall less than any of the other sentries as well. Being able to call this in again and again while fighting is such a massive advantage. If you manage to keep it from getting blown up, you can almost have a Machine Gun Sentry out constantly in the game, because as soon as it goes away, your cooldown is ready for another. Now this is true for a few of the other sentries as well, but only the Machine Gun Sentry can do it in multiple different places. You can just keep deploying them in different spots to get more kills as opposed to being stuck in one spot for a long period of time. Another difference between this sentry and the Gatling is its rate of fire, which is the Gatling's major advantage. However, the Machine Gun Sentry makes up for this by having more specific aim. That way it wastes less ammo and is much less likely to kill you or your teammates because it doesn't just constantly spray out bullets in all directions. As far as the specific factions, the Machine Gun Sentry is really good against the Terminids, which is no surprise. Put this in front of a bug breach and it will have success. I also found that the MG Sentry can even be useful in death, because it can be used as a diversion if things get a little too hairy, because it will draw the aggro and you can run away. This is especially true against the Automatons. Machine Gun Sentry doesn't do particularly well against the bots, but it makes for a really useful diversion since bots can be harder to run away from. My biggest surprise with this sentry is in how well it performs against the Illuminate. It does fine against the voteless, which isn't a surprise, but it does extremely well against overseers. In this clip I had like 8 elevated overseers come at me all at once, and the MG Sentry just wiped through all of them. This is also true of regular overseers, so the Machine Gun Sentry is also a great choice against the Illuminate. Putting all that together, I think this sentry is deserving of the S tier, as it is useful against all 3 factions and great against 2 of them. Alright, let's now talk about the Gatling Sentry. As I already mentioned, the Gatling Sentry has a higher rate of fire than the MG Sentry. This makes it the elite bug breach sentry. The Gatling absolutely melts through small to medium sized bugs, and unless something big pops up out of a bug breach, the Gatling Sentry will melt through it all and rack up a really big kill streak. I especially love how it melts through Brood and Alpha Commanders because I hate them especially. But the Gatling has no problem with them. The Gatling Sentry also does better than the MG against massive hordes. The Machine Gun Sentry will struggle a little bit to rip through one of those hordes of voteless or bugs that you'll see on the really high difficulty levels, but that's not the case for the Gatling. It's got the firepower to keep up. The Gatling, like the MG Sentry, does well against the Illuminate, although I think its lack of accuracy and ammo conservation causes it to struggle a little more against overseers. But its high rate of fire makes it a little better against the Automatons though, because it can rip through bots before they have a chance to shoot it and blow it up. It can even take out gunships if given a little bit of time. But as I mentioned with the Machine Gun Sentry, the Gatling definitely has some downsides. One of the worst is probably how good it is at killing you and your teammates, because the turret basically has no chill. It also runs through ammo really quick, so it's basically good for a quick burst and then it's gone. This is doubly crappy because its cooldown is 150 seconds, so there's a decent wait between uses for you. For those reasons, I think I'd prefer the Machine Gun Sentry just by a little bit, so I'm going to put the Gatling Sentry at A tier, just below it. Next up, let's talk about the two mortar sentries, starting with the EMS Mortar sentry. So I'm going to spoil this one for you guys. The EMS Mortar is my favorite of the two mortars. This is primarily because of how incredibly good it is against the Automatons. The EMS sentry can completely turn the tide of a battle by itself. On higher levels, the bots can just become a bunch of really bulky units chasing you across the battlefield, which makes the EMS sentry the perfect choice for slowing them down. It just peppers tiny EMS strikes all over the battlefield. And if a unit or units gets hit by one of these strikes, they're incapacitated for a good bit of time. It's also pretty likely that the sentry will just keep hitting them over and over again with these strikes until you shoot them down yourself. Also, unlike most sentries, the EMS Mortar can easily hide from harm of automaton blasters and still keep shooting. The EMS Mortar isn't quite as effective against the other factions though, because they swarm. It's a pretty good option against the Illuminate, but doesn't do that well against the Voteless. It also struggles against bugs because of just how massive the amount of enemies is. The bots are perfect for the EMS sentry because there's less of them, but if there's a horde and it gets too massive, the sentry can only slow down pockets of enemies instead of practically all of them. The EMS Mortar sentry does better against these enemies in defense missions though, because they can't spread out nearly as much. Also, please use these during extraction against all three factions, but especially the bots. It saved my butt so many times in those high difficulty automaton missions. So for me, it's a major S tier for the automatons, but it's definitely lower for the other factions, so I'll once again be putting a sentry in the A tier. So now for the regular mortar sentry. This one isn't as bad as I initially thought. It's a very good option in both defense missions and to use at extraction. That's because it will shoot away from your teammates when all of you are at the same spot as the mortar is. This is kind of how you want it to be, because otherwise it's probably going to hit you and your teammates a lot and sometimes kill you. The mortars tend to be inaccurate and don't affect as much of an area as the EMS sentries do, so accuracy is really important. This makes it really hard to get up close and personal with an enemy, because if they are targets, then you might be a target too. The mortar is more effective against the stuff though that the EMS isn't, because of the splash damage that it does. It can be great against the bugs if it happens to shoot where you want it to, and that can be the same with the Voteless. Unfortunately, it will probably shoot the closest enemy, which is probably going to be the one that's right in your face. This is the overall problem with the mortar sentry. It can take out most enemies if it hits them, which is nice. It's just the accuracy can be an issue. So I'd put it in C tier, but because it's so good in defense missions or defending certain points, I'm going to bump it up to B tier. Now we should get into the newest of the sentries, the Flame Sentry. The Flame Sentry might be the coolest looking of all the sentries because an automated flamethrower is just badass. So let's start with the positives. The Flame Sentry, when well positioned, is an absolute hose of death. If you manage to position it high up, it can melt through enemies like no problem. The problem is that is tricky to do. Since the stratagem bouncing thing is still a major issue in Helldivers 2, that's not real easy. The Flame Sentry does really well against big hordes of small stuff like Voteless and Terminids, but it still can easily be swarmed if stuff isn't all coming from one direction. In one direction, the Flame Sentry is elite, so if you can get stuff into a choke point of some kind directly in front of it, you will be set. However, if it's allowed to get swarmed, it's going to have a problem. Although, if the Flame Sentry does get swarmed, at least it blows up into a bigger incendiary explosion of flames to burn up some extra enemies. So it's definitely usable against the Illuminate and Terminids, sometimes even very good and elite. However, it's almost totally useless against the automatons. It just simply isn't built for them. If you position it perfectly, it could do some damage, but realistically, it's awful against the bots. So the Flame Sentry would be F tier for the automatons, and because of that, I can only throw it in a mid tier overall at C tier. Next up is the Tesla Tower. Tesla Tower has had major changes over the lifespan of this game. It went from just a teammate killer to a formidable and usable stratagem in the game that still kills teammates, but a little less often. The Tesla Tower isn't bad against any of the three factions, but it definitely excels against the Terminids. It's made to be thrown near bug breaches and just zap everything as it comes out. It comes with a cooldown of only 120 seconds, so you can use it more often than most other sentries. It also does better than most turrets at taking hits. I've seen Tesla Towers tank a lot of bugs swarming them, and it just systematically zaps them all. So it doesn't struggle with swarms nearly as much as the rest of the sentries. They're also great for being thrown in the middle of a nest to start cleaning cleaning it out before you jump in. You can do this with the Automatons too, because if you throw it in front of a factory or in the middle of a base and catch the bots off guard a little, it can do some work. It can stun lock stuff like chargers and hulks and slowly kill them, as well as knocking out medium and small enemies in one burst. Positioning is very key with the Tesla Tower. You want to throw it into areas where you don't want to be at the moment and high amounts of enemies are. You don't want to mess around with getting near these things because their electricity is still hard to predict, but not impossible. Tesla Towers usually will light up more heavily when they're about to potentially kill you and give you a chance to get out of the way, but if you don't, you will definitely die, unless you have the arc defense armor. And so will your teammates. A quick tip is that putting these behind walls with an entrance nearby that enemies will go through is an ideal place to put them, as they'll zap everything that walks through without putting the Tesla Tower in danger of being blown up itself. I think it's a solid choice for a stratagem, but it isn't quite wonderful enough for how much of a danger it is to you and your teammates. So I'll say it's just good and put it in B tier. Now we have the Rocket Sentry. The Rocket Sentry can be absolutely amazing and works against all three factions, but it's definitely best against the Automatons on a map where there aren't a lot of obstructions like a desert or an ice map. It also helps if it's hilly and has high points to put it on. If you have those circumstances, the Rocket Sentry absolutely wrecks bots. And honestly, even if you don't have great circumstances, the Rocket Sentry still performs very well. It has a lot of accuracy and will more than likely take out the bots before the bots will take out it. There is no enemy the Rocket Sentry can't kill, from gunships to hulks and even factory striders if given enough time. The Rocket Sentry will get it done. The Illuminate is also a good choice for the Rocket Sentry. Its steady fire makes it a great option for taking out harvesters, and its accuracy makes it good for knocking elevated overseers out of the sky, as well as watchers. However, it will struggle against the vote list because it doesn't have a lot of splash damage, and Illuminate maps are paired with urban environments, which don't usually allow for a great vantage point for the Rocket Sentry, so these do provide some downsides against the squids. The Rocket Sentry definitely can work against the Terminids, but placement becomes more critical in this case. You almost have to have the conditions I mentioned earlier, not a lot of obstructions, a hilly environment, because without a solid vantage point, the Rocket Sentry will not be able to take out bugs nearly quick enough before it gets swarmed. The Rocket Sentry has a ton of range, so if you can tell enemies are on the horizon, set this thing up at a place where it can see, and it will rack up the kills and knock out those bigger enemies for you without having to waste a stratagem or ammunition. It's a great sentry, but not quite perfect, so we will also slot this into the A tier. So we've made it to the final sentry, that's the Autocannon. The Autocannon Sentry is a great choice for all three factions. Unlike the Rocket Sentry, the Autocannon doesn't need as much of a vantage point to be effective, and it shoots faster and has more splash damage than the Rocket Sentry. The Autocannon pierces armor very effectively and quickly, making short work of chargers, hulks, and are also a great option for taking out a Bile Titan. Like I mentioned, it has good splash damage, so it can actually do well against small hordes of enemies too. So really, there is no enemy that is a bad match for an Autocannon turret. The only negative is how quickly it runs through its ammunition and how slow its turning rate is. So it can definitely get swarmed by enemies, and also it can't be used all the time. That being said, it can be used to snipe. It can be used in close combat. Big enemies, small enemies, they all bow to the Autocannon Sentry. It is a sentry I would most recommend, and it earns its spot at the top of the line in S tier. Alright guys, so there's the list. We got 2 S tiers, 1 C tier, 2 B tiers, and 3 A tiers. So as you can see, I don't really think there are any bad sentries in the game. Since they increased their defense and tweaked other stuff over the past year of changes, they are all at least pretty good, and most of them are really good. I really like to use sentries when I play, and maybe after watching this video, you may want to add them to your loadout more often too. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please smash the like button for us. It helps a lot. Also, hit up the comments with your guys' thoughts on my rankings. If you liked them, hated them, or somewhere in between, let me know. Subscribe if you haven't done so already, and please hit the bell for notifications so you never miss out on a video, and we will see you next time.